Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar. This is brought to you by FACTS Institute for County Government with support from the University of Florida IFAS. Today's webinar, I like the title. It's titled CARES Act, the end is nigh. And I think that's appropriate given that Congress has still not passed any supplemental COVID relief bills since the original legislation was passed on March 25th. But coming up on all the counties, we have a deadline of our own, December 30th, and that's to ensure that those COVID relief payments, the money has been spent. And for me professionally, I think there always has to be concern with sort of the back end of this stuff. The federal government, in my opinion and experience, can be a little bit tricky. They're very generous at the front end. If it's a major disaster, 72 hours, they come in, FEMA's there, there's a lot of money, there's a lot of promises. Look 4, 5, 6 years down the road, and there's an audit, and there's a potential deobligation, there's a potential clawback. And so we don't want any of that to happen with the CRF money that was under the CARES Act. But there's always concern when you have a federal agency like Treasury that's not really used to giving out grants and dispersing money in this kind of fashion, particularly this amount. And as we'll talk about today, our panelists will, there is probably 8 pages of guidance that Treasury issued. And you compare that with some other federal agencies like FEMA that has their own regulations and 44 CFR, and they have compendiums of policy guidance. There might be a little bit of concern about exactly how every nickel and penny is spent down the road, so a local government is not asked to pay back this money. And so with us today, we have Evan Rosenthal and Carrie Parsons with the law firm of Nabors, Giblin, and Nickerson. They do local government representation all across Florida, and they're one of FACT's long-time corporate partners. And so they got a nice presentation for us today. If you've got questions, put them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. So with that, Evan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Eric, and good afternoon to everyone out there, wherever you may be watching today. And many thanks to FAC for having us here. As Eric mentioned, my name is Evan Rosenthal. I'm with Nabors, Giblin, and Nickerson out of Tallahassee. And today we're going to be talking about a topic that I would be willing to bet has touched most, if not all of you in some form or fashion here during these last 6 months. And that would be none other than the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, better known, of course, as the CARES Act. And Carrie, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide for me, please. Thank you. So as 2020 is quickly coming to a close, and good riddance said that, so too is the CARES Act. As most of you are probably aware, and as Eric mentioned, the CARES Act has a December 30th sunset date that is associated with the funding that was earmarked for state and local governments. Now, we do have some late breaking news for you on this front. As I'm sure many of you have been following, Congress has recently been engaged in discussions regarding the possibility of additional federal relief related to COVID-19. And those discussions have been conceptual up until today. We hadn't actually seen the text of any bills. This is up until literally just a few hours ago when the text of 2 new federal COVID-19 bills was released. We've done our very best in a short amount of time to speed read and digest what we can from those bills. We were reading and discussing them basically up until the moment we got on this webinar today, and so we're going to discuss them in a little bit more depth later on in the presentation. Excuse me. But for now, I just wanted to make everyone aware that within one of the bills is a provision that would extend the December 30th, 2020 sunset date in the CARES Act to December 31, 2021. And again, these bills were just released, and so whether they'll gain any traction and ultimately become law is still anyone's guess at this point. So for now, and for purposes of this presentation, we're going to assume that the December 30th, 2020 date is still the law of the land. So with that all in mind, we thought it might be helpful for you all to provide sort of a summary of the CARES Act, what's left to do in these final weeks, best practices for reporting, closeout, and preparation for the eventual audit of these programs that will be coming. And finally, we're going to touch on where we go from here, including, the potential for additional stimulus related to COVID-19 and what lessons we can take from the CARES Act experience and apply those moving forward to any future stimulus programs. So let's take a look first at how we got here. The CARES Act was signed into law on March 27th, 2020. The wide-ranging stimulus package was aimed at addressing the dramatic reduction in economic activity that was occurring and projected to occur as the virus continued to spread, and also equipping both the public and the private sector with the tools to adapt and survive. At roughly $2 trillion, the CARES Act is easily the largest economic stimulus package in American history, equivalent to about 10% of the country's GDP. To help put it in context, the CARES Act is more than twice as large as the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. That's the federal stimulus package that was passed in response to the Great Recession. The CARES Act is often referred to as phase 3 of the federal response to COVID-19, phase 1 being the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Act, which funded vaccine research and development, and then phase 2, of course, being the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, or the FFCRA as it's better known, which expanded paid sick leave and unemployment benefits. So the various sections of the CARES Act are listed here on this slide. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, as it's really just for the sake of background. But the CARES Act, of course, was the source of the $1,200 stimulus checks that were provided to individuals and families. The Paycheck Protection Program, or the PPP, which provided forgivable loans to small businesses, and the expansion of the Economic Injury Disaster Loan, or the EIDL program, amongst other things. But for our purposes here today, we're primarily concerned with Title V of the CARES Act, which created the Coronavirus Relief Fund, or the CRF, a $150 billion pot of funding earmarked for state, local, and tribal governments to be distributed, overseen, and administered by the Department of Treasury. The oversight authority provided to Treasury notably includes the power to recoup or claw back funds paid to state and local governments under the CRF in the event the Treasury Office of the Inspector General determines that a recipient failed to utilize the funds consistent with the requirements of Title V of the CARES Act. So while the CARES Act as a whole is an extensive piece of legislation, Title V related to the CRF is only about 3 pages in length. And of that 3 pages, the majority of the text concerns the methodology for distributing the $150 billion in funding amongst the various government entities. I'm not really going to get into too much detail about the formula, but it's basically a population-based formula with a minimum allocation of $1.25 billion per state. In addition to making payments directly to the states, Title V of the CARES Act also provides for the distribution of funds directly to certain eligible local government entities, such as cities and counties that have populations exceeding 500,000. Basically, by submitting a certification, an eligible local government can get their funds directly as a direct recipient from Treasury. So you can see here on this slide, Florida's total allocation was about $8.3 billion. And of that amount, roughly 45% went directly to 12 counties that have a population of more than 500,000. And each of these large counties did elect to receive their funding directly from Treasury. The remainder of Florida's allocation, the other 55%, or about 4.6 billion, was distributed directly to the state. And of course, for a while there was a question of how the state was going to use this money, right? Were they going to keep it all and spend it themselves? Or were the other 55 counties that did not receive distributions directly from Treasury going to receive any of those funds, or were they going to just be shut out? The state took a bit of time to ponder those questions, perhaps more than we would have liked. But ultimately, we got an answer on June 10th when the state announced that they would be distributing $1.275 billion to the 55, I'll call them small counties with populations under 500,000. And those funds would be allocated using a population-based formula. So the state designated the Florida Division of Emergency Management, or FDEM, as the state level entity responsible for administration and oversight of the distribution of the CRF funds to the small counties. Sometime in mid to late June, each of the 55 small counties entered into subrecipient agreements with FDEM governing the initial 25% phase one allocation, which would be funded provided on an advanced funding basis. Then in September, the state announced that it was making available another 20% of the funds to the small counties, also on an advanced funding basis, conditioned upon the submission of documentation showing that all phase one funds had been spent or encumbered, as well as a spending plan showing how the phase two funding would be utilized. FDEM also created a deadline of November 16th for all phase one and phase two expenses. And finally, the remaining 55% of each small county's allocation was made available on a strictly reimbursement basis. So after showing that all of your phase one and phase two funds have been spent, counties could submit requests for reimbursement to FDEM for additional funding with a deadline of December 3rd as the last date on which a county could submit a request for reimbursement. So with that background out of the way, let's take a look here at how the CRF funds can be utilized. I mentioned that Title V of the CARES Act related to the CRF is only about 3 pages, and the provisions of the act governing how the funds may be spent amounts to a single paragraph, which is reproduced here for you on this slide. Basically, CRF funds may be used for necessary expenditures incurred due to the COVID-19 public health emergency, provided that such expenses were not accounted for in the entity's budget most recently approved as of March 27, 2020, and were incurred during the period that begins on March 1, 2020 and ends on December 30th, 2020. So what exactly is a necessary expenditure incurred due to the COVID-19 public health emergency, right? As a lawyer, I like to think that, given the chance, I could find a way to justify virtually anything under this sort of malleable standard. And Treasury pretty quickly realized, just how vague these provisions are and the lack of detail in the CARES Act. And so they started to issue guidance to recipients starting on April 22nd. And that guidance has been updated numerous times, most recently as of October 19th. And if you go to the next slide, please, Carrie. Thank you. So the Treasury guidance effectively became our Bible here over these last 6 months in evaluating the eligibility of various expenses under the CRF. And here on this slide, you've got a non-exhaustive list of eligible expenses. It includes stuff like PPE, testing, technology improvements to facilitate remote work, virtual learning, and remote public meetings, as well as assistance to small businesses to reimburse the costs of business interruption and assistance to individuals and families that were directly impacted by COVID-19 due to loss of income. Interestingly, the guidance also establishes that the CRF is not considered to be grant funding, but rather is considered other financial assistance. And what this means is that many of the regulations out there that typically govern federal grant programs, and I'm of course referring in large part to 2 CFR 200, the uniform guidance, which I think most of you are probably familiar with in some form or fashion, those either do not apply at all or only apply in part to the Coronavirus Relief Fund. Specifically, the Treasury guidance tells us that the CRF funds are only subject to the provisions of 2 CFR 200 governing audit requirements, internal controls, and subrecipient monitoring and management. Now, for those of you that have dealt with Treasury before, or really with any federal funding programs, it will come as no surprise that the guidance is unclear at times and sometimes raises more questions than it answers. I'd say it's somewhere around a 2-to-1 ratio, with 2 additional questions or issues being generated for every one that they answer. Now, for all of the counties with populations under 500,000, as pass-through recipients through FDEM, we of course have an additional layer here as well, and that's dealing with FDEM and their interpretation as to the eligibility of expenses, documentation requirements, and so on and so forth. And FDM would sometimes take a different approach or have a different take on things compared to Treasury. You'll see I've bolded the last expense that's listed on this slide, and that is salaries and benefits for public health and safety employees. And this is one area where we initially saw a little bit of a divergence between FDM and Treasury that I want to take a second to unpack here on this next slide. So the very first Treasury guidance issued back in April 2020 provided that CRF funding could be used to meet payroll expenses for public health and safety employees whose services are substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to COVID. The guidance also contained a very interesting provision stating that as a matter of administrative convenience, in light of the emergency nature of this program, a government may presume that payroll costs for public health and public safety employees are payments for services substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to the COVID-19 public health emergency. Now, this of course led many to wonder how this administrative convenience could be reconciled with the requirement that the funds not be used for revenue replacement or for budgeted expenses, which for your public health and public safety payroll costs, those are generally going to be expenses that were budgeted for fiscal year 2020, right? And FDM at first, they were bothered by the implications of this as well. They did not see how you could square using CRF funds to pay your budgeted payroll costs of all public health and public safety workers with the plain language of the statute. And so they wanted to see justification that any public health and public safety personnel were in fact performing functions related to COVID-19. So for instance, that your law enforcement officers were enforcing public health orders, or your EMS workers were responding to COVID-related calls. Then in September, both Treasury and Treasury OIG stepped in and provided additional clarification to try and resolve this issue. They reasoned that by claiming that the administrative convenience presumption, this effectively means that your public health and public safety employees were performing a substantially different function than that for which they were budgeted. And once Treasury OIG issued this interpretation, FDM was convinced as well. This sort of allayed their concerns, and it opened the door to utilizing CRF funding to broadly cover public health and public safety payroll expenses. FDM even began encouraging counties to go this route and utilize the funds for as much of their public health and safety expenses as possible. Actually, in talking with FDM's program directors in the lead up to this webinar, they really hammered home this point. They want to see counties utilizing funds for this purpose. It makes their life easier in terms of verifying the eligibility of the expenses, and the supporting documentation is stuff that the governmental entity is keeping in the ordinary course of its day-to-day operations as well. And for those same reasons, it really makes a lot of sense from the county standpoint too. Another important point here is that once the reimbursement funds come back to you, unless you are funding your public health and safety personnel out of a legally restricted revenue source, like an MSTU or an MSBU, those funds effectively become general fund revenues and can be used for any county purpose. So we've talked a little bit about eligible expenses under the CRF. So now let's have a look at the flip side of the equation, costs that would be ineligible for funding under the CARES Act. At the top of the list, you've got revenue replacement. Stemming from the requirement that CRF funds cannot be used for costs that were budgeted, CRF funds may not be used to make up lost revenues regardless of the source, even if it can be tied back to COVID-19. So, for instance, many counties saw a reduction in the amount of sales tax they took in, both from local option sales taxes and also from state revenue sharing. And despite the fact that reduction in revenues can be linked to the effects of COVID-19, that would not be a permissible use of CRF funds. And importantly, this prohibition against revenue replacement also extends down to subrecipients as well. Now, another area where we would often get a lot of questions is with respect to constructing buildings and other capital improvements. Consistent with the fact that the current public health emergency related to COVID-19 is temporary in nature, long-lasting capital improvements such as permanent physical structures and the like that will have uses after the COVID-19 public health emergency has come and gone generally are not going to be permissible expenditures. On the other hand, temporary structures needed in response to COVID-19, such as for a testing site or for storage of PPE, those are generally going to be fine. Now, some other examples of ineligible expenses, and again, this is just a non-exhaustive list that you have here on the slide. They include things like employee salaries, where the employee is not substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to COVID, and any expenses covered by another funding source or where there would be a prohibited duplication of benefits. Importantly, though, unlike with FEMA funding, for instance, with the CARES Act, you do not have to demonstrate that no funding was available from other sources from a duplication of benefit standpoint. And so now we come to what I like to call the buyer beware expenses. These are expenses that, while they may have a path to eligibility, there may also be some red flags. Funding of schools is the first item on the list. Treasury allows for recipient governments to claim a $500 per student administrative convenience amount, which the state of Florida has gone ahead and done. And by doing so, it triggers restrictions on additional CRF funding that may be provided to schools, including by the counties. Basically, school-related expenses have to fall into one of 7 categories of expenses that include hiring new teachers, developing an online curriculum, technology-related expenses, and additional transportation and food-related expenses. Anything outside of those listed categories would not be eligible for funding using CRF funds. Second on the list, we have funding of nonprofits. Treasury guidance only mentions nonprofits once. It simply states that nonprofits may be used to distribute assistance. But otherwise, the rules governing the provision of funding to nonprofits are really murky at best. And finally, on here, we have broadband expansion. Treasury guidance does state that CRF funds can be used to expand rural broadband capacity to assist with telework and distance learning, but only if deemed necessary due to the current public health emergency. So this means that while things like setting up hotspots or at schools or libraries may be eligible expenditures, projects with a longer term outlook, like installing fiber, likely are not going to be eligible in most instances under the CARES Act. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Carrie Parsons at this point to talk a little bit about what's left to do under this program, such as reporting, record keeping, and closeout, and where we go from here, including more on those late-breaking, just filed new COVID relief bills.
Thank you, Evan, and good afternoon. So as Evan stated, I'm gonna briefly go over where do we go from here? What do we need to do for closeout and the like? So as you might have noticed, because the CARES Act at this point in time is coming to a close on December 30th, that your staff is in full force and gear trying to get all of their documentation either provided to Treasury if they were a direct recipient, or if they were of a population of 500,000 under, to FDEM. Up on the screen for you right now, and as Evan had already mentioned, are the soft deadlines, as FDEM's calling them, for reporting of the different phases for those with populations under 500,000. Those deadlines have come and gone, but again, they're considered soft deadlines, which means that your county still have an opportunity right now to be able to upload your documentation and finalize your documentation. And hopefully by now, since we are in the middle of December, your staff has already started on that. They may be receiving feedback right now, either from Treasury or the state, requests for additional information, and the final countdown is on. So just to briefly go over some best management practices, and I'm not going to get too much into the weeds. We have provided this presentation previously to the Florida Association of Counties, so your county attorneys offices, as well as for our clients, we've already recommended putting these practices into place this month and actually into the closing out after December 30th within January. The next few slides are just to kind of provide you with some highlights of what you might see on an agenda coming up at your commission meeting. And why you might be thinking, why is the CARES Act stuff coming up again when it's getting closed out this month? Why are we reviewing the expenditures again one more time? And that's pretty much due to the fact that we want to ensure that your counties are in the best place possible so that 3 years from now, if there is an audit that comes down with regards to these funds, or if you're questioned by the state on anything, that you've shored up everything so that your reporting and your closeout looks good and that you don't get deobligated. So one of the things that we've recommended to your staff, to county attorneys, is with subrecipients. And for the counties, it varies. Some of your subrecipients might be municipalities. They could be other constitutional offices. They might be schools, businesses, not-for-profits. It just depends on how your county established relationships with those individuals through the CARES Act. But for those subrecipients, right now is the time to make sure that all their reporting's in, it's being uploaded either to the state or treasury, that your staff is gathering in any further documentation or attestations they might need for those individuals, notifying them of any tax implications that could be coming their way, and just making sure that all of the expenditures are chewed up. I can tell you from experience, and I'm sure your staff is going through it right now, trying to claw some of the information from subrecipients is not always easy. We had various deadlines set up for our different clients for their subrecipients, and all of the subrecipients, one way or another, might have provided some documentation by the time their deadlines were there, but they did not provide all of it, and we had to go back and get more. Also, some of your subrecipients, their plans might have changed from the beginning of COVID and the CARES Act. And as Evan has already stated, there's been a lot of shifts through the different Treasury guidance that's come out over the course of the CARES Act on how it can be utilized. So for some of your subrecipients, such as for instance, a municipality, at the beginning of this, they may not have been giving much thought to inquiring with the county whether or not they could get reimbursed for public safety expenditures. But within the last month or two, it's been determined that they can receive those funds as a subrecipient, and the county's been working with them to do that. Well, now is a good opportunity this month and next month to clean up those subrecipient agreements, make sure that the plans that are in the subrecipient agreements clearly and accurately show what the end result of the expenditures were for those subrecipients. And then public safety, as Evan went over, there's been a huge shift in the thought throughout the state of public safety based on some of the Treasury guidance that came out, specifically some of the clarifications that came out in September. And so we have received from the state information as to what they need for purposes of public safety payroll expenditures, which include lists of everyone, payroll logs, pay policies. Employee timesheets are not required right now, but it's a good thing to keep in mind in case there is an audit and you need to true up everything for the various entities. And also overtime expenses and hazard pay. There are specific attestations that both Treasury and the state want for those particular expenditures of payroll expenses. So you may see that your county commission on their agenda may have something in the future where you need to specifically approve an attestation with regards to overtime expenditures for some of your public safety expenses. And this is the month and next month that'll be coming before your board if it needs to. Some other things that you might see come before you on your agendas are contractual services, amending some of the services you might have contracted. For instance, some of your counties may have entered into agreements with chambers of commerce to assist you in the grant funding for small businesses, and you need to make an amendment to it specifically to shore up what all the costs were for those services that they provided, or with your consultants. So this month and next month's going to be the time period where you're going to see that on your agenda if necessary, depending on your county and what your policies are, to make sure that those are cleaned up so that when submitted to the state can clearly see, or when submitted to Treasury, that Treasury can clearly see what your expenditures were, and that they match up with all of the documentation you're providing that you paid out those expenditures. And the same for supplies. You might see a proof of payment coming through for approval on an agenda item to submit to Treasury. Most of that's more so behind the scenes, that your staff's going to be gathering all this documentation, if they haven't already, to submit to Treasury. And then one additional thing that we are recommending to all the counties, and as county commissioners, you may have already seen this a couple of times come before you as the CARES Act expenditures for your county have evolved, that before you're presented with plans of expenditures where the county is going to use the CARES Act, and you've been asked to make a finding that those expenditures are necessary expenditures. And the reasoning behind that, in case it wasn't explained to you before, is that in the Treasury guidance, over and over again, Treasury states that if a local government or a state puts into place any sort of plans or expenditures, they need to make a determination that those expenditures are necessary expenditures under the CARES Act. And so that's why some of your county attorneys might have come knocking on your door as commissioners and said, hey, this is coming before you on your agenda. We're asking that you make a finding that these are necessary expenditures. That documentation from the minutes of your meeting where you make those determinations that they're necessary expenditures and you take a vote are actually then uploaded to the state and Treasury as supporting documentation that your county followed all the rules necessary for your expenditures. What we're recommending to our clients is, because the plans for the use of the CARES Act have evolved over time, there's been a shift to more public safety payroll in certain circumstances, or some of the small business and individual plans are being funded at a greater level than originally anticipated. We're recommending that a summary of sorts of what the expenditures actually were that were submitted to FDM be provided to your board one more time, either this month or in January, and that the board make one final vote that these were all necessary expenditures. And that way, if you have any audits come down the line in the future, you'll have those minutes to be able to hold up to Treasury or to the Attorney General's office or Inspector General's office, excuse me, at the federal level. If you have an audit, to be able to say, hey, look, we did approve all these expenditures as necessary. And then, of course, one thing that we always recommend to your staff, to the county attorney's office, we deal with many appeals of other federal funding, such as FEMA funding, deobligations from municipalities and counties and the like. And one thing that always comes into play is, do you have the records that are necessary for your funding? Sometimes, and some counties right now are experiencing deobligations from 15 years down the line. And so sometimes the records aren't always readily available. So one thing we are recommending is that your staff designate a department or a location where these records are kept, and that these records are kept until you verified with either Treasury or the state that everything is closed out. It's been at least 3 years since the closeout, and that these records can be destroyed. And one thing we've been saying to both the county staff, county attorneys and the likes is, Don't leave any funds on the table unspent. You have 2 more weeks. Now's the time to get those requests for reimbursement up to either the state or Treasury. And also remember that any of the services and items that are purchased using the CARES Act, they have to actually be in hand by December 30th or have been already provided as services before December 30th of this year. Some of the payments don't necessarily have to be made by December 30th, but the services, the goods and items do have to be in place within your counties. So what everyone really wants to know is, where do we go from here? Well, as you may have seen in the news since the CARES Act came out, as there's been various talks about additional stimulus packages. There's been, for instance, the HEALS Act or the HEROES Act that have been proposed by various members of Congress throughout the summer into the beginning of fall, in which would provide additional stimulus to the US economy. Most of the stimulus packages out there, they follow the basic categories that I put on your screen that include a second stimulus check, a additional enhanced unemployment insurance benefits, aid to state and local governments, and support for small businesses, including another round of PPP. Now, there is a new bill, and Evan mentioned this earlier, that is not called a stimulus bill, it's called a relief bill that has been proposed. And the reason that a relief bill has been proposed before the new Congress comes on board in January and the new president also in January is due to the fact that, as I'm sure you all are well aware, enhanced unemployment benefits, they end come December 30th, as well as the moratorium on various things such as evictions. Those come to an end. Student loan relief comes to an end on December 30th. And so there's been a huge push because of the state of the economy right now, because of the ongoing pandemic, and how there is an uptick in cases and certain states are once again closing down, that there's a need, and economists are saying there is a need for another stimulus. And so this new relief bill that is being proposed is kind of a stopgap measure. It's for the most part only supposed to affect the next 3 to 4 months. And that is because Congress is already talking about, in the next Congress that sits on January 3rd, as well as the new president on the middle of January, that more stimulus bills that follow the basic pattern that is on your screen are going to be proposed to take us through the next year for relief. So to go over some of what this relief bill that's been proposed, what it is and what it encompasses, just to give you some background, all of the stimulus bills that had originally been proposed were pretty much dead by the time we got around to beginning of November. Then Congress took their break for Thanksgiving and there was nothing new on the table. So no one knew what to expect when they came back from Thanksgiving break. So about a week and a half ago, a bipartisan Senate group and the House Problem Solvers Caucus, they came up with what they're calling again the relief bill. And the reason they're calling it the relief bill again is because there's no individual stimulus payment like there was through the CARES Act of that $1,200 individual payment. So the relief bill was not released until late last night. And then it wasn't posted for public view of the text until I think we finally got a hold of it around noon today. And what the bill originally was proposed as is a $908 billion bill that they have been talking about for the last week and a half. It would ensure enhanced unemployment benefits that would go through the next 4 months at $300 a week. So it's not the $600 a week, but $300 a week. It would provide more assistance to small businesses in the amount of $288 billion, school funding in the amount of $82 billion, assistance to local governments and state governments in the amount of $160 billion, and also some further funding for contact tracing, vaccine distribution, and testing, as well as some relief for student loan funding. Again, there was no stimulus check last week. There was a push for a stimulus check that did not end up in this, the final result that came out last night. And the holdup over the last 2 weeks, there was 2 hangups. The one is they also were going to include in the bill a short-term shield for liability for businesses, particularly hospitals and the likes, from liability from their employees getting any sort of right to be able to sue them for contracting COVID in the workplace. So this was a short-term shield. Some members of Congress wanted it to be a permanent shield. Others wanted it to be short-term, and then the states be able to put something in place individually and determine for their states what the liability shield will look like. And also the other hang-ups that has occurred over the last week is the local government and state funding, both because of the dollar amount itself for the funding. Some want more, some want less funding. And then also because some of the members of Congress wanted to ensure that communities that were under populations of 500,000 received adequate funding, because they did not believe through the CARES Act that they did receive what they considered an adequate slice at the pie. So with all of those hangups being negotiated over the last week, last night, the bipartisan group of both senators and representatives from both parties came out with 2 bills. They've now broken the $108 billion into 2 separate bills, the first of which is a $768 billion bill that includes the unemployment enhanced benefits for the next 4 months. It also includes student loan funding assistance, as well as assistance for funding for contact tracing, vaccine distribution and testing, school funding, assistance with small businesses. And that bill, however, doesn't include the liability shield, nor does it include the local government and state funding. They separately came out with another bill at the same time for $160 billion, which includes the local government and state funding, as well as the short-term liability shield. So what they essentially did was take out the 2 controversial sticking items over the last week from the one bill and put them into their own bill for Congress to look over. It looks like both bills may pass the Senate, but there's a lot of question on whether or not the bill with regards to the state and local funding and the short-term liability shield will actually end up getting passed by the House by the end of the year before a new Congress is seated. It does look like the $768 billion measure is more palatable now that those 2 items are removed from it, and that is more likely to be passed. That being said, we did take a look at the bill for the local government and state funding and want to give one of what it applies, because the $160 billion is actually more than what state and local governments received initially in the CARES Act funding. So if it does get passed before the end of the year, we want to kind of just give you a brief breakdown from the hour and a half we got to read it of what is included within it. So it would apply to 2021 fiscal year. However, it just says that the funding applies to the 2021 fiscal year until the funding runs out. It doesn't have a deadline of December 30th, 2021, except for under a certain allocation. So it would come in a series of 3 payments to the state. It would not work the same way that CARES Act funding worked, where a direct payment was received by those counties that were over a population of 500,000, and then the remainder was passed through the state. Under what the legislation says today, and of course it can change by the hour, but what it says today is that all the direct component of the funding would go directly to the state, and the state would disperse to all of the counties and municipalities within the state. So the amount that the state would receive would be dependent on both population and need, and there would be a series of 3 payments that would take place in the fiscal year 2021 for the states. The first payment being 30 days after the enactment of the bill to the state. The state then has 30 days to pay out the funding it's required to pay out to the counties and municipalities. So whatever the state gets in, they're required to pay out 40% of what they receive in to the local governments. 50% of that 40% has to go to municipalities, and 50% has to go to counties. And the determination of how it's going to be allocated is left up to the governor with a few caveats. The governor can determine how to distribute that 40% based on population or proportional need, or both. So the governor does have a little leeway on how they can distribute these funds to the local governments. What the bill essentially does is it extends the CARES Act expenditures, how you've been able to fund things so far, until December 30th, 2021, but it also provides for 2 other uses of this fund. So not just the use that it had to be COVID related, a necessary expenditure, unbudgeted, and be used by December 30th, 2021, but you could also use it on, it says expenditures in 2020 or 2021 that local governments have not been able to make because of a decrease or delayed revenues. So for instance, because of a decrease, say in your sales tax dollars, you weren't able to pay for something in the fiscal year 2021, that you could use these funds for that, as it's established right now in the legislation. So it does have a component of revenue replacement. And it also has another prong where you can also use it for the distribution, storage, and administration of approved COVID-19 vaccines. So it does change it a little bit, and it does evolve a little bit from where your CARES Act expenditures are required by providing that component of revenue replacement, as well as for assistance with vaccine distributions. And if the states receive any of this funding, there are a few caveats that have been put on the states and a few strings. The first is that they're prohibited from increasing the pension funds for the state beyond what the level of increase was in 2019, except for the cost of living increases. And the state also can't cut revenues to local governments below 2019 levels without specific justifications of necessity. That is kind of just a brief breakdown of what the relief bills are going through. Again, the relief bill, due to the fact that it has now been broken down into 2 separate bills, makes it a little more challenging for that local government and state funding bill to be passed by this Congress, but it is definitely something to keep an eye on in the next week or week and a half. And with that, we are happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Carrie. And Evan, you did a nice job of describing the Treasury guidance as the Bible that y'all been referring to, and you walked us through and explained that it's not grant funding, it's other financial assistance. I've always found that if you're dealing with grants, it might be a double-edged sword if you have minimal guidance versus a ton of guidance. But can you reiterate the primary things that Treasury and OIG has said that you have to comply with for other financial assistance? I think you said 2 CFR and 200.
Yeah, and so there's only specific sections within 2 CFR that apply here because it's considered other financial assistance, and it's the provisions are the sections of 2 CFR dealing with audits, so those are going to apply here. Your provisions of 2 CFR dealing with subrecipient monitoring and oversight. And I think there may be 1 or 2 other sections that apply as well. But other than that, 2 CFR is not going to apply to the CARES Act funds. And so that includes sections like procurement, for instance, and other sections that would ordinarily apply to all of your federal grant funding programs. Other than those sections that are specifically enumerated within the guidance, and there's a question within the guidance that spells them out in case you want to just pull that up and double check them all. But other than that, again, 2 CFR is not going to apply to the CARES Act funds.
Okay, I mean, you heard my opening comments. I'm always a little skeptical on some of this because of our experience with FEMA, and as Carrie said, the clawbacks that we've experienced 15 years down the road. Federal law has been changed, thank goodness, but there's always a concern to me about an agency being very flexible at the front end and then coming back later and deobligating. Can we go back and talk about, it was slide number 8, and it was dealing with the public safety expenditures and OIG's, I think it was November 20th, 21st, affirmation of what those funds can be used for. Can you go through that one more time carefully? Because if a first responder is doing something substantially different, but it's only 2% of his time, 3% of his time, and the other part of his, so COVID, but the other part of his time he's doing his normal duties, where does that leave them?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. And it's something that, we were at first skeptical about too, when we first saw the guidance. FDM was similarly skeptical. There was this provision in there saying that, as an administrative convenience, they were basically going to allow you to claim all of your public health and public safety employee payroll expenses for the fiscal year, even to the event they were already budgeted, which just seemed like it couldn't be reconciled with the no revenue replacement provisions of the CARES Act as well. But as time went along, Treasury and then Treasury OIG, they continue to sort of to reaffirm that was the position. Treasury OIG, I think when they came out with their stance on it, which I believe was in September or October, they again said that basically the way they are looking at it, for because of COVID-19, any of your public health and public safety personnel, they consider them to be essentially performing a substantially different function than that for which they were originally budgeted for for fiscal year 2019-2020. So in their eyes, that is essentially how they've justified it. And you can carry that analogy over to other budgeted employees too. So if you had, say, like somebody in your tourist development staff that after COVID-19 you reassign them, and now they are assisting in processing individual assistance or small business assistance grant applications. So their salary at that point, to the extent they are considered substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to COVID, which they would be if they're doing that with the majority of their time, their salary would then become an eligible expense under the CARES Act, even though it was, again, originally budgeted. So that's sort of a summary of this. And, again, I think, we were all sort of internally skeptical. FDEM was skeptical, but honestly, Treasury and Treasury OIG have been about as clear as they ever are on anything with this point. So I think we all feel reasonably comfortable at this point that those expenses are going to be eligible and allowable.
Yeah, and what to add to that, one mechanism that we're working on with our clients to put in place is just kind of one-page summaries of all of the work that the public safety employees have put into COVID-related matters, keeping it general enough to also cite the Treasury guidance that they are automatically assumed substantially dedicated, but just documenting it on letterhead, having that signed by the various department heads or the sheriff's office, in anticipation that down the road, you have staff turnover and others who originally had that knowledge, but 3 years down the road, you're getting an audit and they're getting questioned about something being substantially dedicated. By having that kind of documentation within your records, that is going to help you refresh your memory. And also it cites directly to the Treasury guidance, which is also helpful. And one other thing we are actually seeing for those with populations of under 500,000 right now is that when they're submitting public safety payroll expenditures that include administrative support personnel for those public safety officers, some of the administrative support personnel payrolls are being questioned by FDEM. So if your county has not been questioned yet, I will guarantee you will get a request for further information where it seems like the state is treating them a little differently than they're treating, for instance, sworn officers or those directly in the field.
So that raises maybe my last question, and just in terms of the flow of money, the state is the grantee for this, the counties are the sub-grantee. There is a validation process that DEM is doing before they reimburse the county. And again, I'm going to ask you to just kind of, it's a little conjecture, but let's say several years down the road, then an audit finding says that County X spent their money in a manner that was inconsistent with Treasury guidance or the CARES Act. What do you think would happen? Because who would owe the money? My sense is that the state, just like with FEMA, they deobligate other disaster declarations for that money. Can you kind of speculate on that process?
Yeah, so, and I'll definitely give Carrie a chance to chime in on this one too, but essentially, as you mentioned, the state here is the direct recipient of the funds. So, in the event Treasury comes back and, attempts to claw back any of those funds, they would be doing it directly from the state. Now, there is obviously a subrecipient relationship there too between the state and the counties, with the counties being the subrecipients. And there is a subrecipient agreement that all of the counties entered into with the state. And there are, I believe, provisions in that would essentially allow for the state to come in and claw back funds in the event of a misuse. So, or in the event any expenditures were deemed ineligible or unallowable. So basically, the first step in the process would be Treasury calling back the funds from the state, from FDEM, and then FDEM, again, they have those contractual rights to come in and potentially try to claw that back from the counties as well.
And that's the nomenclature. I said grantee and subgrantee. It's recipient and subrecipient.
Yeah, since they're technically not grants again, so that's what we've been using.
I don't see any questions in the chat, which means you guys were extremely thorough, and you were. I appreciate you coming on today, and I actually also talking about the other legislation. I think our national association sent out an email. There's an afternoon briefing on some of those new bills. But with that, I want to thank you guys for taking the time and coming on, and thank you for presenting at our conference as well. Appreciate your partnership, and let's hope that we get another release bill soon.
Yes, thank you for having us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Great to be here.
Thank you.